what I hope think tanks will look like in the future is entities that are a lot more agile, that are really focused on leveraging and inspiring partnerships, that will co-create with as many other actors as possible to really influence change. They will move from just generating evidence to also working with social movements to affect some of that change. That will, use the vibrancy of, social movements to translate the ideas that they bring, through the evidence that they gather. I think they will be smaller, leaner, more global. At least I hope there will be, and ideally, especially for those like ODI that come from a development past. Working on a much more egalitarian basis, looking at learning from others and not just showing others what our evidence demonstrates.
I think that in the future, a leader of a think tank will have to, be open to having a think tanker go work somewhere else for a while, bring someone else from another think tank, share ideas, be very generous with the branding, with the staff, with ideas, and that those would be ways of moving forward these principles of creating evidence, of influencing that are at the core of a think tank, and that I think are relevant in a networked world where a future think tank will be, right? So the way of navigating that is probably through a lot of generosity.
Try to get the most diverse team that you can that you need for the specific knowledge you wish to generate, but make sure you have the people in place who culturally and language-wise know how to speak and relate with your key audiences.
Build alliances with like-minded people and think tankers all across the world to maximize the impact of your work.
Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you very much for being here at this closing session for the OTT Conference 2021. We are going to be finishing talking about not the past, but the future. I am Sonia Jalfin. I'm the director of Sociopúblico, a strategy and communication studio for complex ideas based in Buenos Aires, and a fan of the think tank community. Today we're going to be talking in the talking panel, as I mentioned, about the future, because think tanks have faced unprecedented challenges during the last year. Some of them have had to change to survive during the pandemic. Some others have been changing from before. I was delighted yesterday and in the previous day in the conference, and I'm sure you were too, to listen to so many new ways to approach research and do the work of think tanks, like the examples we saw by 4 Hours or by Chatham House in the panel organized by Soapbox, where we learn how they are creating future scenarios for prospective thinking and doing things we are also eager to do at Sociopúblico to help find new ways to approach the challenges that think tanks try to solve. So we are changing, and at the same time, our environment is changing a lot. The socio-political environment, the technology we are using, and all these new trends are affecting the context in which think tanks exist. We are going to be discussing how think tanks are going to look like in 100 years. That's the challenge for today. And we have 3 people here who are probably the best persons we could find to try to answer this question. I will leave you to introduce yourself. I don't know if Daniela, would you like to start? And we'll go all the way around.
Thank you very much, Sonia. My name is Daniela Schwarzer, and I'm the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, which is a think tank, a member organization. We publish 2 journals. Yes, and I'm very pleased to be on this panel today.
Thank you, Daniela. Andrea?
Hello, everybody from Quito, Ecuador. I'm Andrea Ordoñez. I'm director of Southern Voice. We're a network of 51 think tanks across the global south. And I've been a think tanker all my life, so really happy to be in this panel.
Thank you, Andrea. Dede?
My name is Dede Amanor-Wilks, and I'm going to be reflecting on 4 different types of think tanks I've been working with over the last 20 years. most recently with the Institute of Economic Affairs, based here in Accra, Ghana, and with the African Center for Economic Transformation, which is a Pan-African think tank, also based here in Accra, Ghana, but also with two more unusual types of think tanks that perhaps are not usually thought of as think tanks. One being the UN's Economic Commission for Africa, which has a think tank function as well as a convening function, but also an operational function. It works in the field. And also one which really you wouldn't think of as a think tank at all, ActionAid International, which when I joined in 2007 had just decided that it was moving away from direct development work to policy work, because the rationale was there's no point building schools and clinics if government policy won't change.
Thank you, Dede. Okay, so before we start with the difficult part of the panel, I'd like to ask you only 3 questions to try to break the ice. But these are multiple choice questions. You have to reply with just 2 letters. In 100 years, do you think think tanks will exist? Okay, so this is a full O. Think tanks will exist. Excellent, thank you. So second question. What is not going to change in the think tank community in the future? What is going to remain the same forever? So the first option is the fascination for acronyms in the think tank's name. Second one, complaining about lack of funding. Daniela and Dede had to think both. And we have the first OTT. Excellent. Okay, so lack of funding, I think it won. And the third and last one, what will change for the think tanks in the future? We will be working from home or other locations, or C, we will be working from our offices. Excellent. And we have the out of office reply here. We are going to be working outside the office for sure. Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to the serious part of this panel. I would like to ask you, what do you think are the current challenges and risks that think tanks are facing today, and particularly will face in the future in your country or region? Who would like to start? Daniela, maybe, because I have you on the top left.
So thank you very much. So my region I define as Europe, if that's okay. So what we are seeing in Europe is, first of all, it was already in one of your questions, there's a competition for funding. And as we are right now I would say in the middle, but by far not at the end of an economic crisis, which will have repercussions in the private sector, but also in the public sector, I guess one of the challenges is indeed constant funding. I don't think that makes it different from Europe than other world regions, but I do see that as a think tank director, one devotes considerable time not to content work, but to securing the financial sanity of the organization. And that is probably something that is going to grow as a problem. Secondly, I think the competition for talent, and in a way, this is related to the financial piece, because I'm speaking for a foreign affairs think tank, and we compete with very different organizations for the most talented staff, whom we would like to recruit. For instance, of course, right now as a foreign affairs think tank, you need people specializing on defense, on technology, digitization, and other issues, which no longer, as a think tank, you just have the option to go into a think tank or into academia, but you can actually go into the corporate world. And the more political risk is also something that the private sector worries about. The competition for staff will be increasing, and hence the financial pressure, because salaries in other sectors are, of course, much higher. And if you want to have talent with you that works with everyone sort of on eyes level, you of course need to look for the best talent who can think forward and who can share ideas and translate research work into very tangible results that are relevant to stakeholders in government, in civil society, but also in the corporate world. Then I would like to briefly touch upon political polarization. And I would say Europe, in comparison to other world regions, is still just at the start of possibly an age where we will see more polarized public debates, more polarized media, people not really wanting to talk with each other if they are in one field but not in the other. And of course, as a think tank, if you want to share your ideas and you want to reach out, you should try and speak with everyone. At least those who are interested in change and who want to be informed and want to engage in the ideas you have. So both the polarization of the political sphere, but also the polarization of the public sphere will be a challenge to think tanks, because in a way they have to adapt and try to be relevant and be heard. And the more we have to do with fake news, deep fakes, also elements of hybrid warfare within our societies, the question of the value of research-based knowledge and the fact of credible communication is gaining in importance. And thinking about think tank strategy also has to deal with that, in my view, more and more. Finally, I would say we have a huge technological challenge because the knowledge generation will change over the next years and decades more and more. Think tanks in my field to date don't really work with big data, but I think they will have to. They will compete with organizations that sell knowledge and pursue business interests, but seem to deliver similar things like think tanks do. And hence the challenge for think tanks really is to stay relevant in that regard. Finally, I think in this generally more polarized world, think tanks will have to say, and many do, including my own, while research, of course, is conducted in a way that we don't start with a hypothesis about the result. We start with hypothesis before we go into research, but we do not predict the outcome. However, we, of course, have to take a certain stance in a debate where a lot of contestation of basic norms and values is going on. And we have, as an organization, have very recently made the decision, although it's in our founding documents, but even now in the political debate, to say loud and clear where we stand in terms of our understanding of liberal democracy, of liberal world order, and how we situate ourselves in an increasingly ideological debate. I'll leave it there for a start. Thank you.
So I think I'll build on from Daniela's first points. When I was thinking about this panel, I was organizing my ideas into like the changes, the trends, and the future of like three things. Kind of like first the space where we will be working, where think tanks will be working, and how that will change. Then the second level, the institutions themselves, like the think tank themselves, and third one, the profile of the think tanker and the individual working there. And so for these challenges and risks, I'll look into this more broad space of where we're working and some of the challenges I see. I think that one of the challenges for think tanks is the changes in where decision making happens, and when where think tanks would want to or would have to influence if we want change to happen. And we have this traditional perspective that this would happen within government, but I think that is changing very rapidly. I think that every time it's, for example, corporations are much more important. We might see a future where we have even bigger corporations with even much more power than we do. And just the discussion about vaccines right now, of the power that some corporations are holding, and that's a space of decisions that think tanks should be looking into and considering. Related to this, it also seems to me that think tanks struggle sometimes with identifying and understanding their key audiences, and these audiences are like a moving target, right? And this, I was also thinking about this from Anne-Marie's keynote 2 days ago, when she was saying how it was very important for her to reflect on the values and the perspectives that millennials we're bringing into think tanks. And I think in general, think tanks still need to think better about which are their audiences, who these audiences are, who these new generations are going to be, what are going to be their priorities, and so on. And I think that the other challenge in terms of the changes that we're seeing around the world that will affect the think tanks is that I see that the high levels of fragmentation and inequality that we see in society make it harder for think tankers to be able to relate to so many different realities. Like it's important to acknowledge that there's such great diversity of realities out there in the world that we are unable to relate to all of them, right? And that maybe this is something that was easier in the past, but I think that will be even harder moving forward. So I think I see those some of the main challenges about the audiences, where the decision making will happen, and what are the realities that people care about and that they relate to, and how think tanks can talk about them.
Thank you, Andrea. Dede, do you want to talk us about the challenges we are facing now?
Thank you. Okay, thank you. 4 challenges I'd like to highlight. One, as Daniela highlighted, finance and competition over dwindling donor resources. That's a major challenge as of now. I don't think it's always going to be a challenge, but it really is the key challenge now. But also in the midst of that competition for dwindling resources, I think that what's going to distinguish those think tanks that survive and those who go to the wall, there's a need for well thought out communication strategies to cut through all the overload in this information age. Think tanks that think and act fast and have effective communication strategies will survive while others go down. Thirdly, in the post-COVID age, digitization is the growing challenge, but also the growing inequality arising from digitization in an area such as Africa, because digitization may increase inequality if the digi-divide worsens. So that's something for think tanks to keep an eye on. And then finally, in the context of Africa, technological leapfrogging. Daniela talked about the need to keep up with technology, even in Europe. So imagine in Africa, where we're already far behind the rest of the world in terms of technology. Think tanks are going to have to lead the charge in sort of leapfrogging to the next productive function, the next technological frontier, and carry everyone along, not increase the digi-divide as we do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dede. So let's go to the following question. You talked about some of the mega trends we are facing already, but I'd like to ask you to describe in more detail what you think is going to be affecting think tanks in the future and now already, in terms of mega trends that are affecting our world, from climate change to the acceleration of technological improvement and innovation, from globalization, or for instance, the African trade agreement, things that are outside think tanks, but that are affecting the way they work and produce.
So on tech, I already said a few things, but I'm willing to go into this more deeply. First of all, the tech skills that think tanks need to conduct their research, I think, are important. And this brings up a question of partnering with companies that actually own data. And here comes a complicated problem. How do you validate the data you may be able to work with? How do you pay for it as a think tank? Well, you know that data is used for business purposes. So I think this is a really, really tricky question, because, as I said earlier, there will be more organizations who will provide knowledge that they don't generate by employing, 30 to 50 fellows and researchers, but who will just run their software over documents, over the internet, over data that is available, and produce relevant knowledge that may actually compete with think tanks, and to my knowledge already does. So this is particularly important, I think, in the field of security, but also other areas. So from that side, the question of competitiveness of think tanks as advisors is closely related to technological progress. The other issue that I would like to mention in that context is the degree of specialized knowledge that think tanks will need. And here, I think the future is, because I spoke earlier about the problem of hiring people who can work elsewhere, is to choose people who have that specialized knowledge, who live in a different world during their workday, but who may want to add something to their portfolio and help think tanks in certain areas. We have made very positive experience with that kind of association of people who have a particular background, be it in security, be it in IT, who are not foreign affairs people, but who do wish to bring their knowledge to our work, for instance, on regulatory challenges or other issues. Of course, you always have to make sure that you don't lose your independence and your credibility in the research work you do, but I think it's possible, and we have made very good experience, and I think more of that will have to happen. Let me maybe pick just one other megatrend that plays out at this moment, and that is the increasing global polarization and systemic competition that we all know has emerged between the West and China. We see more and more that independent research on China is being sanctioned by China, by imposing sanctions on individuals or whole research institutes, by making it impossible for people to travel, by making it impossible to have dialogue, even if we are think tanks mainly focused on research. I think the dialogue and the exposure to others is extremely important, and we just currently see that this is getting more and more difficult with a number of major players. And that is something that is worrisome because, yes, if you really want to understand what is happening in other countries and you want to build options and ways forward, you mentioned climate change, of course we need to deeply engage with China, the United States and other major players to look for a global approach. And if you can't go there, if contact is impossible, if you are standing for an organization that is no longer, from the Chinese point of view, a legitimate partner in conversations, I just see how other institutes that are in that place face increasing difficulties to actually do their work.
So the polarization between the West and Africa, you see, Africa right now is very, very preoccupied with the creation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was launched in January after COVID delays. And this is like the huge mega trend that eclipses everything. Because if the African Continental Free Trade Area is successful, and if it is successful, it will create the biggest free trade area in the world. It will be an area of 1.3 billion people, and with a combined estimated GDP of $3.4 trillion. It's sort of a major turning point in Africa's history. It's a do or die moment, sink or swim, because if the African Continental Free Trade Area is successful and is able to create a market to boost African production rather than to make Africa a recipient of goods from everywhere else in the world, then the rivalry between China and the US will have far less impact on Africa than it has over the last period since independence 60 or so years ago. And also it means that Africa will now become essentially one country rather than 54 countries. Therefore, it will have a lot more bargaining power. It will be able to sit at the table with mega countries such as the US and China, and instead of being a recipient of it, will in a way be able to dictate its own terms rather than be a recipient of everything that is sort of dumped on Africa, both in terms of goods and policy. Because mobility will increase, African talent will be able to move all over the continent. In addition, Africa being the most donor dependent, being the most dependent on big donors such as the US, Africa funding sources will greatly diversify if this experiment works for Africa, because African sources of finance will increase exponentially. But if we're talking about the current situation, the rivalry between the US and China, to be perfectly honest, has in a way created greater opportunities for Africa, because the Chinese are a lot more flexible in the type of development assistance they give to Africa. The Chinese aid doesn't come with the conditionalities that, say, IMF, World Bank assistance and big donors like the US, their assistance comes with. So in a way, the rivalry has created a bit of a breathing space for Africa. And I think it is now that Africa is really concentrating on building its integrated economy to sort of shield it from geopolitics, which has really sort of been, Africa has very much been buffeted by geopolitics and these rivalries since the days of the Cold War. So we really are concentrating now on how we sort of immunize ourselves from that, much more so than in the past.
Andrea, do you want to give us your vision from Latin America? And then, and I know we haven't touched on the other mega trends. We can come back to that in a minute, but I think it is interesting to see how the geopolitical trends that we all see are seen from different parts of the world.
Well, I think that maybe to add, maybe this is not particular for Latin America, but to the different regions where think tanks are still relying on foreign funds for further functioning. I think one of the things to consider is how this polarization and division between Europe, US, and China is going to translate into changes in priorities of funding and funding opportunities for think tanks to carry out research, right? And also to just the diplomacy of where is going to be the focus of attention for think tanks in Latin America and other regions as well. So I think maybe that's one way of looking at it, for specifically like their implications for think tanks. And I would expect that in summer years we'll see more of that diplomacy through funding for think tanks and so on happening. I mean the quickness with of how emerging powers like China, India, Russia been vaccine diplomacy is, I think, one of the signs that they see diplomacy and reaching out to these regions as key for themselves as well, right? So I think think tanks will probably have to be aware of these and react wisely to funding opportunities and so on.
Dede, you mentioned other megatrends when you talked previously, like for instance, what's happening with information overload and technology. Do you want to give us a more detailed approach to those other megatrends that you think might influence the future of think tanks?
Definitely, digitization is the very big one. I mean, here in Africa, COVID has actually dragged us now into the digital age. We've been forced to. Even old fogies, like you find in many of our think tanks, but we were forced during lockdown to think in new ways, to convene ourselves in new ways, to train our staff in new ways, and it was actually pretty exhilarating. It was great to be able to be forced to do things that we'd never thought of doing before. And it does make us realize that going forward, we can't afford to go back to the old ways. And you know, it looks likely that COVID is going to linger with us for some time. And so that makes it all the more imperative that we sort of permanize the things that we've been doing over the last 1 year. So it's also a huge opportunity for Africa in terms of the continental free trade era, because Africa is such a vast continent, the second largest geographically in the world. And now that we're thinking about think tanks working across borders, which is quite a difficult proposition when you have currently 54 countries, it's a brilliant time to be developing digital technologies, exploring how we can use them for think tanks to work more collaboratively now in building this huge dream a united Africa, essentially in economic terms. We haven't been able to achieve it politically, but now if the Continental Free Trade Area works, it will be achieved de facto. And digital trends are going to be really central to our ability to make this experiment work.
Yes, Daniela, you mentioned that you foresee that the competition for skills and try to bring diversity into think tanks is something that worries you somehow. Is it becoming harder in the last few years? And how do you think, you mentioned some experiments you've been doing trying to bring people from other domains. How is that working, and how do you think that can be taken even further?
Yes, the competition for talent is growing, and also the scope of talent that think tanks will need is going to grow. So if you look at foreign affairs think tanks a few years back, they would essentially be people who had studied IR, political science, maybe the odd economist, but no real mix of disciplines. And we have moved beyond that. I think most think tanks that work in foreign relations have. So there's now a good mix of competencies they've gained through their academic studies. However, think tankers need to have other skills, because you're not just a researcher. You are a person who should be able to convey their insights in a very straightforward and easy shape and form orally to audiences, be it small in an advisory conversation, or be it big, either in a parliamentary hearing or a huge conference. And also think tankers need writing skills. Also, the methodology of knowledge generation, as I touched upon earlier, is going to change further. So we as think tanks need to make sure we get the right people on board to be able to engage with others who are involved in anticipatory work, and then who have the training to work on policy recommendations that take into account very complex developments going on. We are now living in geopolitical and geoeconomic times, so a basic understanding of economic and financial developments, the climate crisis as it evolves and as it has repercussions on many, many fields of policy, all this needs to be understood. The point here is not necessarily by one person, but by a team, of course. You need people who work together and who are willing to work with other disciplines to actually contribute something meaningful to the policy debate.
Thank you, Daniela. We have one question here from Pablo Garfias-Torren, who said he thinks that what you were saying about the competition for talent is very interesting, but seeing that from a student perspective, he thinks it's hard for students to access think tanks. What do you think about that? Is there something think tanks should be doing better to open space for students?
Yes. So I suppose, and here I'm only speaking, of course, for my own institution, but also what I see in others around us happening. Internships are important. Student assistant jobs. As a student, you don't have to work only just in a university institute. You can work for a few hours with a think tank. I personally teach a class at the Free University of Berlin for the second time round now this semester with a think tank colleague of mine who helps me with that. And what we do is we pick a topic that has a huge policy relevance, and part of the course treats it as you would treat it in a traditional academic European integration undergraduate course. But then there's an element where we speak about the transfer of this knowledge into the policy world. So I bring in people who either work in policy or who work not in my think tank because I can represent that part, but in other organizations that work on this link between academic research and the policy world. And that way, my students get an understanding of what I am looking for as a think tanker and how what they study gives them knowledge and skills that they can bring to the think tank world. And the way we work in the course and what they have to do to get their grades is actually very hands-on. They have to write occasionally very short summaries or give extremely short oral presentations on just a few things in 2-3 minutes. Then they, of course, do a traditional presentation. But in the end, they don't write a normal term paper. They have to write a policy paper, and they learn throughout the course how they have to do that. And when I taught that course last year, I was really surprised of the quality I got. So I can only encourage others to do the same.
I think that one of the changes that we're going to see in how think tanks work, that may relate also to Simon's question, is whether think tanks are going to be more rule-based or value-based and principle-based. And I think that in a world that we're going to go where things are going to be changing very quickly, and when think tanks will have to react very quickly, the organizations that are better able to react based on the values that it has, the principles that they're looking to promote, and so on, instead of following very specific kind of institutional rules that think tanks also have in terms of how one communicates, through which channels, the peer review process, all these processes that we've kind of built into the workings of think tanks. But we have organizations that, based on values and principles, the different think tankers can approach problems that are brought to them, may be best placed to be sustainable in the longer term. That those are the think tanks that may be able to last longer. Also, I think that the teams that the think tanks that can have teams that are more fluid and more horizontal, that they can be teams come together, not in a hierarchical way, but because of the different skills and capacities that are within the think tankers to tackle specific problems, will also be very important. And in terms of like the big picture of whether the think tanks are going to go for being big or small and so on, I think it'll have to do a lot with what I was saying at the beginning of where we think that the decision making is going to happen. And I would imagine that there is a new generation of think tanks that is going to come up with a much stronger focus on influencing non-government actors, like corporations, like other civil society organizations at the global stage. I would imagine that's going to happen, and I would also imagine that another set of think tanks that go and inform the city level will be really relevant, right? It wouldn't be crazy to imagine that at some point cities will have a similar status at the global level than countries, given how big they are, how relevant they are for problems such as climate change or others, and how they represent the voices of so many individuals, right? So I think that we'll see that variety of think tanks emerging and responding to the problems at different levels of decision, and some of them we may not imagine right now, but think tanks should keep an eye on that to respond to that and see where those decision making points are and how to reach to them.
The main function of think tanks in 100 years. Good. I'm glad you asked me that, because I think I've got 3 lovely examples I'd like to share with you. Okay, it's basically one, but three aspects of it. You asked at the beginning, Sonia, when we were having our little fun session, whether we thought think tanks would exist in 100 years' time. And I would like to pose another question, whether governments will exist in 100 years' time. And I'd like to give some examples of why they may not need to exist in 100 years' time. So the first one, if we talk about greening the future of Africa, I was quite inspired by the Chatham House simulations that were shared with us before this conference started. When you look at what the Chatham House simulations were able to do to tiny enclosed space like Piccadilly Circus in London, then imagine what we'll be able to do in Africa in terms of creating a green economy. And I'd like to focus on one activity, which is the work of agricultural extension workers that operate in most African countries. Governments hire extension workers to go and work with farmers, to show them best practice, to teach them husbandry and how to farm better. So imagine in 100 years' time that think tanks will be able to create those simulations unmediated by government. They'll be able to take farmers on tours all around the world to see best practice in terms of agricultural practice. They'll be able to show farmers, give farmers the opportunity to test the outcome of the different inputs that are on offer in terms of seeds, fertilizer, manure, and so forth. Instead of relying on the expertise of agricultural economists, extension workers, governments, agricultural ministries, and so forth, these simulated models will actually show farmers what happens if they use a GMO seed or an organic seed, a local seed or a seed from somewhere else in the world. What will happen to the soil? What will happen to their plants? What will happen to agriculture? And they will be able to make up their own mind. They won't need governments to push packages on them. They won't need donors to say, this is what you need or this isn't what you need. They will be able to work it out for themselves, see the outcome, and themselves decide what inputs they want, how they want the future of their lands to look like. The forests especially, this will be an opportunity to show farmers what will happen as a result of their activities in forest zones. That's one example. The second example I'd like to look at is the example of youth. Enrique said in the opening session, in the think tank piece, I think in his recent think tank piece, he talked about younger think tankers. He said younger think tankers do not have to wait for their turn to be influential. They can command many more followers on social media than all their seniors put together. And I think one of the lessons of COVID in Africa, in Ghana, has been that we can't leave the youth out when it comes to digitization. During the period of lockdown, the kids who came from well-off background, from middle-class families and good schools, they had access to online learning. Whereas the bulk of children, those that live in the rural areas or in deprived urban areas, had no access to learning. During a whole period of lockdown, a whole year, they were without access to learning. This can't go on. Not long before he died, Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, proposed an idea of $100 computers in Africa. It hasn't taken off, but I think think tanks would be able to not have to now convene policymakers, bring them around the table, persuade them that this is the policy we need, but deal directly with the youth, go into their classrooms, create online platforms where the kids themselves will decide, how do we create a computer that we can all have access to, a $100 or cheaper computer. And they won't need their governments to do it for them. All they need is the simulations, the digital platforms, and they will do it themselves. And then third, since we're an all-women panel, in terms of gender, how can we ensure that women enable a less inequality in the future, a more equal world? And one of the lessons from Africa, I think, has been in terms of mobile phone technology. Countries such as Kenya have been very creative in their use of mobile money. And that has already broken down some of the barriers to financial inclusion for women. Recently, we see a trend of some of the big think tanks, like the Economic Commission for Africa I had mentioned. They are able, because of the kind of resources they command, to put on boot camps for girls. Girls can code boot camps. And this is really the future of inequality, the future of equality in Africa. When you have girls coding, they will be able to create computer programs and computer simulations that project gender equality and social equality as the new status quo, not just in Africa, but globally.
Thank you, Dede. We were talking about finding and hiring talent, and you also mentioned this ideal possible collaboration between think tanks in different countries in Africa and working remotely and using technology. Do you think that would help you hire anywhere in the world? And are you doing it already? And this question goes to all of you. Is it easier now for think tanks to bring in people from any place in the world?
talent mobility is one of the most exciting developments under the African continental free trade area. So if we start with Africa, if it works, borders will be open. Talent will be able to move across borders. And I think think tanks will be part of that talent that's moving across the borders. If Africa becomes a more viable proposition, there may be less migration to Europe. There may be less illegal migration, people dying at sea and so forth, less of a crisis in Europe, what to do with, unwanted migrants from Africa, illegal migrants from Africa. At the same time, a stronger and more economically united Africa will also be able to participate in the global labor markets. Africa will send its talent all over the world, and talent from all over the world will come to Africa. So there will be a symbiotic relationship. I think it's going to be something very beautiful, and I do believe that in 100 years' time, the world will be a completely different place.
Thank you, Dede. Daniela, there's another question that goes into something you mentioned at the beginning. You talked about taking a stance in the political realm.
I think that, first of all, I think it is exactly right what Anne-Marie Slaughter said in the beginning, that independence of think tanks is key, but that doesn't mean you're void of any principles or values that you base your work on. And that's very much what I tried to say in my own words earlier on. Now, I think funding is, of course, a key source of influence if you let it be just that. And a lot of scrutiny has been going on over the past years on who funds whom, who has direct influence, and so on. And I can only speak for our own example. We have a diversity of funding resources. So we have foundation money, we have research money, we have government money, and not only German government money, but only money from governments that accept that we are independent in the way that we conduct research and that they cannot control the results or prevent us from publishing results from that research. Of course, also corporate money comes in, but we make sure that, again, here, there's no link between the donor and the result of a project or a research that is going on for a longer time. So I think it's possible. You constantly need to evaluate where you are. And I think the big thing for me, my discovery was you need such a solid funding base that you can actually say no. That's important. That when someone comes and proposes something, you don't feel, oh my God, I have to take it and bend over backwards to make it work. But you can just say, no, this doesn't fit us. And you should also be able to say goodbye to donors who don't respect your independence. And that is only possible, of course, if you have a multiplicity of actors who want your work to be independent, who support you, and who see a value in this. And my observation at the moment is that there's really far more scrutiny than 10 or 15 years ago. Just look at a number of New York Times articles on the Washington scene. There have been similar articles in the German press. It's important to do this. And we haven't ever used it, but we have set up an ethics committee in case we are in a situation where we have to decide on funding or an institutional cooperation where we have doubts and we feel we want to do it, but we're not entirely sure. But we have actually never come into that situation. But it feels very good to have a group of people who will then be an extra control function and make sure we don't make mistakes.
Andrea, how do you see this? Yes, I was going to ask you, how do you see that this, how hard it is for you to find this balance between having an opinion, but at the same time remaining independent?
Well, I wanted to reflect that maybe in 100 years, our concept of independence is going to be quite different. Like, I think that most think tanks started, or in my experience with think tanks, you start with an understanding of independence that is non-partisan, right? Like that's the first kind of like concept of independence. And now you have to see it kind of like evolving, kind of like now you have to consider the funding sources, right? And funding from corporations or funding from other governments, and so on. So it's kind of like, I think in 100 years from now, we may have some very a different way of framing and understanding the independence of think tanks. And I think particularly in this role of corporations that have easily taking over the discussions at the global level. I think that think tanks and scholars in different areas of work need to be more proactive beyond their national borders, right? And beyond the policymakers in their countries, because it's really at that stage where a lot of the things that are impacting things at the local level are really happening, right? And so some think tanks feel confident about going to, let's say, within the UN system, of going to a government official from another country and sharing ideas. But for, I think, many think tanks, that they still see their work, for example, if you are an Argentinian think tank, of going and saying to a Ghanaian official within the UN system, let's push forward this idea, right? So I think this more networked world of how governments and institutions are going to work at the global level are also going to change how we work, and will probably also change, for that reason, what we think will be an independent think tank.
And we already had a little discussion in this group on the, maybe governments won't exist in the shape and form we know them now, and how will think tanks then interact with them. I just want to add to the thoughts that in particular Dede has already shared. I think, at least for the European context, and I only wish to speak for that, think tank work on European or international affairs is on good policy, but it's more and more also on how to make it happen. Because what we realize at the moment is there's so much knowledge and there's so many ideas out there to improve certain situations, but in the current decision-making systems, the implementation is close to impossible. So when you talk to policymakers and you tell them what your idea is, they will say, yeah, great, I like it, but it will never happen. So this is a quite often answer, an answer you get quite often. So from that, we have already concluded that, of course, our role is not only to generate ideas and present them in a good way, but also to map the way forward, how a possible compromise can be built. And that's not only a theoretical endeavor, but it's actually engaging with various parties that are relevant to the decision making. So in Europe, obviously, it's governmental dialogue between different countries, but we increasingly work with stakeholders from civil society, from the private sector, in order to create, I'd say, a community of knowledge and a joint understanding how implementation can actually work once there's a legitimacy and a political consensus for certain ideas to move forward with. And I think that part of the work is going to be more and more important, simply because with everything we have said about the changing of political landscapes, of political dialogue, of polarization, and so on, this question of actually getting things done will be more and more difficult to answer.
So the government will become less important. Maybe government will still have to be there. If it has to be there, it will be to mediate the different competing interests. So Andrea has been talking about big corporations. So maybe there's a danger that without government, the citizen will be, though it'll take us a period for the citizen to become sufficiently empowered to the extent that it will be able to stand up to big corporations, for example, in making the decisions from computer simulations. So just to reflect on the point but Enrique made the point at the beginning of the conference, and many people have made the point that think tanks have to turn into change hubs. And that was the reason I mentioned these other two types of think tanks, those with greater resources than your average think and do tank. The models such as ActionAid and the Economic Commission for Africa, a UN commission. Because I think that if think tanks, if we really want to become change hubs, then we are going to have to be able to command far greater resources. And perhaps the model, the sort of action age child sponsorship model, that may be a way for communities to empower themselves, unmediated by the big international NGOs. Perhaps small communities will, in addition to government resources, be able to organize themselves so that very kind-hearted housewives in Germany or Italy will be able to deal directly with the children they want to sponsor in Africa or Asia or Latin America. They're using digital tools. Those communities will be able to project themselves directly, unmediated by INGOs. Will be able to project their needs, or will be able to create networks with similar communities around the world. And gradually, the influence of governments will perhaps recede. Maybe governments will still be there, but their influence will be less important because there'll be alternative sources of power.
How do you see this, Andrea and Daniela? How do you think governments and other stakeholders that are so relevant to the think tanks community are going to be evolving, and how that is going to be affecting think tanks? So how the others are affecting us?
It's a good question to imagine, like, what would like governments or people in making decisions would want would approach think tanks for, right? Like, what is it that they would seek from us, from think tanks? And I think maybe one and this may go back also to Claire's mention in the chat of the functions, is that if we imagine a world where people are each time more and more educated, and there's more and more ideas kind of like emerging everywhere, and there's knowledge and evidence that are coming from many different sources, and maybe the role that one of the roles that think tanks will play, and that maybe governments would, or decision-making entities would seek support from think tanks, is kind of like knowledge building, right? It's kind of like this capacity of getting all these evidence kind of like together and building on it, instead of like having all these different ideas being dispersed and being kind of like everywhere and receiving messages from so many different places. Maybe there's a role for kind of like organizing, synthesizing, and building from it, right? And saying, okay, we've agreed on this evidence, so let's move and build on that and build on that. And so maybe that's a role that think tanks will play in the future, and maybe something that governments would find useful for think tanks to do for them, to make sense of all this knowledge that will probably be out there that we're already experiencing. But if you think about how many more people are going to be educated in 100 years, and how many more are going to be creating ideas and coming up with ideas, it's probably going to be massive. And there's going to be someone having to make sense and organizing all this somehow.
Yes, I first of all, I agree with what Andrea just said, and I pick up the disinformation piece. First of all, think tanks are challenged by the whole change of the way our public sphere is working, because we as think tankers have to make sure our knowledge is credible and reaches even those who don't wish to really access that kind of thinking, because they prefer to be in their silos where they only consume very selective sources. So this is really the question: how think tanks multiply their own channels, because media will more and more select whom they admit, like on opinion pages or in websites also. So I think this is really one of the big challenges, but it's also an opportunity to actually position think tanks as organizations that do thorough fact-checking, that speak up if something they have produced or they have published is being misused or even distorted. Also, when speaking publicly on panels, on seminars, think tankers will be more and more confronted with either very polarized debates, or maybe even with people either on the panel or in the audience who misuse the work think tanks produce, who simply distort facts and spread false information. And of course, there will be situations where think tankers can't immediately validate what is being said. But I think it is one of our responsibilities as think tank leaders to think through what our staff will actually need to be able to do. For instance, when in Germany the far-right populist party AfD emerged, we thought through, as we work a lot with parliamentarians, and they have a very different discourse and narrative they bring. What does it mean for us? How do we train, in particular, younger staff to actually be able to engage in a debate which is maybe more violent, more ideological, maybe not entirely fact-based? And this is nothing only sort of related to various political parties, but it also happens when you are out on social media, when you have audiences you don't know. This is the new normal. And I think that's why, again, training and skill development also in that regard is really important.
Thank you, Daniela. We are coming to our last minutes of this panel. I have a last question on my side. Please give us your final comments. My last question is, imagine you have a grandchild who in the future is going to be funding a new think tank and is asking you for advice. So let's say this is in 100 years, you are together with your grandchild, and what advice would you give to these grandchildren of yours interested in the think tanks landscape community and trying to do something in terms of public policy influence? What would be your advice?
So I'll start with one idea. We spoke about mobility of researchers, of think tankers, and how much of a gift it is that we can all work more internationally now through digital channels, but also because people move around. And my advice would be, try to get the most diverse team that you can that you need for the specific knowledge you wish to generate, but make sure you have the people in place who culturally and language-wise know how to speak and relate with your key audiences. Because I do believe that reaching those who should be informed about the things you have thought up and developed remains key. And the more diverse we are as think tankers, maybe the audiences will still in some places be extremely local or culturally very closed off, but you still need to reach them. And on a small scale, this is happening. Our institute has internationalized a lot. But when we talk to the German government or the German parliament, we also have to do it in German, of course. And so this, I think, will in the future also still be very true, that certain stakeholder groups will not internationalize that same way. And they need to be involved, not only as information takers, but also in the process of generating knowledge. And that will remain a constant challenge to be globalized and mobile, but also very local in some of the work we do.
Let's see how AI translation is going to be helping us with that also. Andrea, you mentioned the audience in your first response, and I really like that because again, from the beginning, you thought like the future of think tanks is going to be possible if they really connect to their audiences. Is your advice going to go that way too, or what advice would you give to your grandchild?
Well, I think first to build on Daniela's comment on languages, I think, and that's something that I was definitely thinking about for the future think tanker, like thinking about which languages you need to speak. And with this, I don't mean only like our spoken languages, but these other ways of, for example, programming, understanding artificial intelligence, and understanding algorithms. I think this is going to be very critical as well. So I would imagine that in that diversity of a team that Daniela was suggesting to add, I would include these being able to understand the back end and how computers and the digital world is functioning. I think that will be critical. It's kind of like the way of understanding what's behind the technology that is driving many of the things that we see nowadays. And I think that those tools are going to be very critical to understanding and reaching out audiences, right? So they will definitely be very critical. And then I think that my other recommendation to the grandchild would be to be very generous about think tanking. I think that in the future, a leader of a think tank will have to, be open to having a think tanker go work somewhere else for a while, bring someone else from another think tank, share ideas, be very generous with the branding, with the staff, with ideas, and that those would be ways of moving forward these principles of creating evidence, of influencing that are at the core of a think tank, and that I think are relevant in a networked world where a future think tank will be, right? So the way of navigating that is probably through a lot of generosity.
Okay, so my advice would be build alliances with like-minded people and think tankers all across the world to maximize the impact of your work. And maybe, I don't know if I can relate that to a question I see on the screen, that somebody asked the question, what design you would choose if you had unlimited funds? And Simon asked about the first $1 billion think tank. Is this in the future? So yes, build alliances toward that $1 billion think tank, but please, it shouldn't be owned by a few people. $1 billion think tank should be owned by a billion people in order to decentralize power, but work towards consensus on those big megatrends like greening our planet, getting back the forests, keeping the forests that exist, building up consensus on the best way to do this in a way that empowers both the people and the planet.
Thank you, Dede. So we are closing with decentralization and generosity. I think that's the best way to finish.
Thank you very much, Sonia. That last question as well, I think, has given us a lot of things to think about. And I want to thank Dede, Andrea, and Daniela for that. Thank you very much for joining us.